He was born a prince but died in disgrace, shrouded in bloodstained curses. It was under his command that Paris turned into a river of blood. His name still echoes as a whisper of evil in the history of France. This is the story of Charles IX, the king whose single order wiped out a generation. Charles IX was born on June 27, 1550, in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the third son of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. From the very beginning, he was an extra piece in the power game. The throne was never meant for him. He had older brothers, and everyone believed Charles would never wear the crown. But destiny in royal dynasties always has its own plans, especially when death hovers over every heir. His childhood unfolded in the shadows of conspiracies, court intrigues, and early funerals. In 1559, when Charles was just 9, his father, King Henry II, died in a tragic jousting accident. A splinter from a lance pierced his helmet and entered his eye, and that marked the beginning of the bloody legacy his son would one day inherit. After Henry's death, the throne passed to Charles's older brother, Francis II, but he lived only briefly, dying at the age of 17. In 1560, Francis died from a festering ear infection, and suddenly, young Charles became King of France at just 10 years old. But the real power was in the hands of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, who wasted no time launching her own ruthless political game. Charles was a sickly child. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as reserved, nervous, easily agitated, plagued by fevers and nightmares. Though he was taught by learned scholars, he cared little for books. His true passion was hunting, the only thing that made him feel powerful and alive. Even then, courtiers noticed something disturbing about him. He could sit in silence for hours, then suddenly erupt in manic laughter or bursts of rage. His moods shifted rapidly, and his mother only fueled the fire, shaping him into a pawn of her ambitions. By 1563, he was declared of age, and Charles began to seize real power. That's when the transformation began, from a frightened child to a king whose paranoia and cruelty would carve a bloody scar across French history. Following the Peace of Saint-Germain in August 1570, France experienced a brief period of religious calm. The Huguenots were granted amnesty, limited freedom of worship, and the right to maintain fortified towns as guarantees of security. This compromise failed to resolve deep-rooted divisions between Catholics and Protestants. At the royal court in Paris, especially among the Catholic clergy and aristocracy, the peace was viewed as humiliating and dangerous. Catherine de' Medici, though playing the role of mediator, remained a pragmatic Catholic. She tried to maintain equilibrium between the factions using marriage policy as a tool of control. With this aim, she arranged a marriage between her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, and the Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre. The wedding was scheduled for August 1572 in Paris. It was intended to symbolize national unity, but instead laid the groundwork for one of the bloodiest events in French history. In the lead-up to the wedding, thousands of Huguenots, including military leader Gaspard de Coligny, gathered in Paris. Their presence alarmed the Catholic population and court. Charles IX, who was in a psychologically unstable state, was torn between loyalty to peace and pressure from his mother and the Catholic nobility. Reports from the time describe him as prone to fits of rage, paranoia, and nervous exhaustion, often plagued by anxiety and distrust. On August 22, 1572, an unsuccessful assassination attempt was made on Coligny. The Huguenots saw it as a provocation, while the royal court perceived it as a threat to national security. Coligny survived but was injured. This further radicalized both sides. Catherine de' Medici and her closest advisors began convincing Charles IX that the Huguenots were preparing a rebellion and that preventive action was necessary. Some accounts claim that the decision to carry out a large-scale purge of Huguenot leaders was made during the night of August 23rd to 24th. Charles IX's role in this decision remains debated among historians. Some sources suggest he resisted until the last moment, while others claim he not only approved but ordered that none of the Protestant leaders be left alive. A quote often attributed to him is, "Then kill them all, so that no one may accuse me." Though its authenticity is uncertain, it reflects the atmosphere at court. On the night of August 23rd to 24th, the massacre began, an event that became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Initially intended as a limited operation targeting Huguenot leaders, the violence quickly spiraled out of control. Catholic citizens of Paris joined the killings, and within hours, a full-scale slaughter of Protestants swept through the city. It is estimated that 2,000 to 3,000 Huguenots were killed in Paris, including Coligny. Over the following weeks, pogroms spread to other French cities: Lyon, Orleans, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Metz, Rouen, with total nationwide casualties estimated at 10,000 to 30,000. After August 24th, Charles IX publicly assumed responsibility, declaring before the Parliament that the actions were necessary to prevent an uprising. However, many contemporaries believed he acted under the influence of his mother and her advisors. Some pointed to his mental instability as a key factor. From that point onward, Charles's authority as monarch was deeply compromised. Even Catholic nobles began to question his capacity to rule. His personal condition deteriorated, and his relationship with his mother devolved into a struggle for control over the remnants of royal power. After the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the authority of Charles IX as king was significantly undermined both within France and internationally. Protestant countries, particularly England and the German principalities, condemned the massacre, viewing it as a betrayal of trust. In contrast, Pope Gregory XIII praised the actions of the French court and even commissioned a fresco in the Vatican to commemorate the event. This polarized response only deepened France's political isolation. Charles IX began to display clear signs of psychological instability. Contemporary witnesses reported that he suffered from nightmares, constant anxiety, insomnia, and paranoia. Some accounts describe how he compulsively washed his hands, seemingly trying to cleanse himself of innocent blood. He frequently changed decisions, flew into rages over trivial matters, and distrusted even his closest advisors. His physical condition also deteriorated rapidly. Charles had been in frail health since childhood, but after 1572, his symptoms worsened significantly. He began to lose weight rapidly and suffered from chronic pulmonary bleeding and a persistent cough. Physicians of the time, unaware of the exact nature of his illness, tried various treatments, from bloodletting to herbal infusions, none of which proved effective. Modern historians suggest he likely had advanced tuberculosis, compounded by mental breakdown. Relations with his mother, Catherine de' Medici, also worsened after the massacre. Though she remained influential at court, Charles began resisting her control. He gathered his own advisors, including moderate Catholics and former Protestants. However, his attempts to form an independent policy were weak and short-lived due to his worsening physical and mental state. In 1573, Charles faced another crisis: the uprising in La Rochelle, led by surviving Huguenots who refused to recognize royal authority. The city declared autonomy. Charles ordered a siege, but the campaign dragged on and ended in compromise, effectively reinstating the terms of the Peace of Saint-Germain. This was perceived as a political failure and further exposed the crown's weakness. By 1573 to 1574, Charles IX's health had declined irreversibly. Eyewitnesses described him spending most of his time in his chambers, absent from public life, suffering from constant fever, loss of appetite, and physical exhaustion. His mental state remained unstable. At times he demanded harsh repression, while at others he retreated into depression and isolation. He was said to cry out the names of those murdered, plagued by hallucinations and delusions. Meanwhile, a power struggle for the succession had begun. As Charles had no sons, his younger brother Henry, then King of Poland, elected by the Polish-Lithuanian Sejm in 1573, was the next in line. Catherine de' Medici worked diplomatically to secure Henry's return to France and prepare him for succession. In early 1574, Henry left Poland and secretly returned to France. Charles IX died on May 30th, 1574, at the age of 23, in the Château de Vincennes, after several days of convulsions, coughing blood, and lapsing into unconsciousness. His body showed signs of extreme emaciation and skin lesions. Before dying, Charles said goodbye to his mother and officially passed succession rights to Henry. After his death, the throne passed to his brother, who became Henry III. Charles IX left behind a controversial legacy, a monarch during one of France's darkest massacres and a king who never became an independent political force. His short reign symbolized the deep crisis of the French monarchy amid religious wars and the decline of the Valois dynasty. After the death of Charles IX in 1574, the French throne passed to his brother, who became Henry III. The Valois dynasty continued, but its position remained precarious. The effective loss of control over several territories, the weakened authority of the crown, and the rise of regional autonomy significantly complicated state governance. Charles IX is remembered primarily as the monarch under whom the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre occurred. That mass killing of Protestants became the defining event of his reign. Despite ruling for only a short period, the massacre had long-term consequences not only for France but for Europe as a whole. The slaughter altered international perceptions of the French monarchy and fueled anti-Catholic sentiment across Protestant states. In historiography, Charles IX is often portrayed as a weak ruler, dependent on his mother, psychologically unstable, and incapable of independent political action. However, his reign coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in French history. The country was deeply divided by religion and social unrest, and compromise was nearly impossible. Despite the instability, there were attempts at structural reform during Charles's reign. These included early efforts to modernize the army and reorganize the tax system. In 1563, even before his official majority, France concluded its role in the Italian wars with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. However, these accomplishments were overshadowed by internal conflict and civil war. During his reign, the role of the Paris Parliament increased, as it began to assert influence over religious and social policy. Still, efforts to centralize power failed in the face of growing autonomy among Huguenot regions and the Catholic leagues. In some areas, royal edicts were openly disregarded, indicating the depth of monarchical crisis. Scholars often emphasize the influence of Catherine de' Medici, who, although not formally queen regnant, controlled most state decisions. Her involvement in the massacre remains a matter of debate. Some view her as its chief architect. Others see her as someone who manipulated her son's fragile psyche. The Guise family, a powerful Catholic noble house, is also suspected of having influenced the decision to eliminate Protestant leaders. Religious wars in France did not end with Charles's death. On the contrary, the massacre triggered another wave of conflict. In the decade that followed, the country saw renewed violence, especially between the Catholic League and the Huguenots. Political stability remained elusive. From a historical perspective, the reign of Charles IX marked a turning point where the sacred legitimacy of the French monarchy was fundamentally undermined. The king, once expected to symbolize unity, instead came to represent terror and impotence. After his rule, the monarchy was increasingly viewed not as a force for justice but as a tool of factional power. Charles IX left no male heir. His only child, Marie Elizabeth, died young. Thus, his death not only ended his personal reign but brought the Valois line closer to extinction. His successor, Henry III, would become the last Valois monarch. Modern historians regard Charles IX as a tragic figure, a young man thrust into power during extreme turmoil, without the character or skills to manage it. His personal instability, the dominance of his mother, court intrigues, and the broader political chaos contributed to disastrous decisions whose effects would haunt France for decades. Following the death of Charles IX in 1574, the French throne passed to his younger brother, who ascended as Henry III. Although the Valois dynasty continued formally, its grip on power was visibly deteriorating. The monarchy had suffered irreparable damage during Charles IX's reign, politically, socially, and symbolically. The loss of territorial cohesion, the rise of regional autonomies, and the destruction of the monarchy's moral authority contributed to the progressive collapse of the old royal order. Charles IX is remembered primarily for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This single event became the definitive symbol of his rule. Though he governed France for only 14 years, the massacre marked a turning point in European religious and political dynamics. The mass killing of thousands of Huguenots in Paris and other cities led to a sharp rise in religious radicalism and intensified the wars of religion in France. In historical literature, Charles IX is frequently described as a weak king, mentally unstable, politically dependent on his mother Catherine de' Medici, and incapable of coherent leadership. Yet this view requires nuance. Charles inherited the crown during one of the most volatile periods in French history. The religious divide between Catholics and Protestants had already escalated into civil war. The pressures facing the young monarch were immense, and his authority was limited from the outset. Despite the overwhelming internal conflict, Charles's reign did see some attempts at reform. Military modernization efforts were initiated, and there were early efforts to reorganize the tax and financial systems. However, none of these policies were developed far enough to counterbalance the effects of civil war and political division. These limited administrative changes were quickly overshadowed by the internal chaos following the 1572 massacre. Under Charles IX, the Paris Parliament grew in prominence, increasingly asserting influence in religious and civic affairs. Yet the monarchy's attempts to centralize power failed. Protestant-controlled regions and Catholic strongholds alike ignored royal edicts. In practice, France became a fragmented state with overlapping local authorities and private armies loyal not to the crown but to religious leaders and noble factions. Catherine de' Medici remained the true center of political gravity throughout Charles's reign. Though she held no official ruling title, she controlled the royal council, directed diplomatic policy, and influenced decisions at every level of government. Her precise role in planning the massacre remains contested by historians. Some regard her as the chief architect, while others see her as acting under pressure from the ultra-Catholic Guy's family, who sought to eliminate Protestant influence through violence. The crisis of monarchy during Charles's reign was not limited to France. Internationally, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre shocked Protestant Europe. Queen Elizabeth I of England froze diplomatic relations with France. German Protestant princes declared Charles IX an enemy of the Reformation. In Geneva and the Dutch provinces, printed propaganda portrayed him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. Protestant authors compared him to Roman emperors like Nero and Caligula, and pamphlets referring to him as the Butcher King circulated widely. Inside France, censorship and repression intensified. A royal edict in October 1572 made it a capital offense to publicly criticize the king or speak about the massacre. At the same time, pro-government pamphlets were published under Catherine's supervision, claiming the massacre had been necessary to suppress an imminent Huguenot rebellion. The social consequences were equally severe. Religious identity overtook all other forms of affiliation. Mixed marriages between Protestants and Catholics became rare. Whole families were divided by faith, and public denunciations became common. In both Protestant and Catholic communities, extremist groups gained prominence, making moderation nearly impossible. Charles IX's personal legacy was further shaped by the absence of a direct heir. His only child, Marie Elizabeth, died young. With no sons to continue his line, the Valois dynasty stood on the brink of extinction. The burden of continuity passed to Henry III, who would become the last Valois monarch before the rise of the Bourbon dynasty. In retrospect, historians often characterize Charles IX as a tragic figure. A young, sickly king pushed into a role for which he was neither mentally nor politically prepared. His reign coincided with one of France's most destructive civil conflicts, and the decisions made under his rule, particularly the sanctioning of mass violence, damaged the monarchy's legitimacy for generations. The reign of Charles IX did not cause France's crisis, but it crystallized it. The massacre that took place under his watch shattered any remaining illusions about the unity of the French state. His time on the throne marked the final unraveling of the myth of the king as the ordained protector of national harmony. From this point forward, the monarchy would be associated less with divine authority and more with bloodshed, betrayal, and national fragmentation. The aftermath of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre brought not only a collapse in the monarchy's moral authority, but a systematic breakdown of France's internal cohesion. What had been envisioned as a targeted political purge quickly spiraled into uncontrolled mass violence, with consequences that extended far beyond Paris. In the months following the massacre, the administrative apparatus of the French crown began to erode. Royal governors and officials in several provinces stopped enforcing edicts from Paris, fearing reprisals from local Huguenot populations or backlash from radical Catholic groups. Local autonomy surged as cities and regions increasingly governed themselves according to religious affiliation rather than loyalty to the crown. In Protestant-majority towns such as Montauban, La Rochelle, and Nîmes, citizens formed defense councils and armed militias. These bodies formally recognized the king but operated independently, collecting taxes, passing regulations, and organizing regional defense without royal oversight. Meanwhile, in staunchly Catholic cities like Bordeaux and Rouen, militant confraternities emerged, dedicated to rooting out Protestant influence and pushing for even more extreme measures. Social fragmentation deepened. Religion became the single most important marker of identity, superseding social class, regional origin, or political allegiance. Mixed-faith marriages ceased. Families split apart over theological disagreements. Public life was dominated by accusations, denunciations, and show trials. In many regions, royal justice was replaced by ad hoc tribunals run by religious factions. Abroad, the massacre shocked Europe. In Protestant strongholds like England, the Dutch Republic, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the event was portrayed as calculated genocide. Queen Elizabeth I responded by withdrawing ambassadors and freezing diplomatic channels with the Valois court. German princes gathered in Frankfurt to issue a formal denunciation of Charles IX, branding him an enemy of the Protestant cause. Geneva, Zurich, and Strasbourg held public mourning services for the victims, with sermons that denounced the French crown as the embodiment of tyranny. In England and the Netherlands, plays, poems, and pamphlets were produced that equated Charles IX with ancient tyrants. He was frequently compared to Nero, Caligula, and Herod, rulers known not for strength but for madness and cruelty. One of the most influential pamphlets, published anonymously in Geneva and titled Le Tyrant Sanglant, the Bloody Tyrant, portrayed Charles IX as a sadistic butcher who murdered his own people. The pamphlet coined the term Le Roi Boucher, the Butcher King, which would follow him in European discourse long after his death. Within France, criticism was strictly censored. An October 1572 royal edict imposed the death penalty on anyone who spoke ill of the king or publicly mentioned the events of August. Simultaneously, the court launched a propaganda campaign presenting the massacre as a justified preemptive strike against a Protestant conspiracy. Official bulletins, crafted under Catherine de' Medici's supervision, emphasized the necessity of maintaining Catholic order and claimed that the Huguenots had planned to assassinate the royal family. Catherine de' Medici's political influence remained unshaken in form, but not in substance. She continued to dominate the King's Council, but her reputation had collapsed among both Catholics and Protestants. Catholic radicals accused her of being too lenient, while Protestants viewed her as the chief orchestrator of genocide. She became a figure of universal suspicion, blamed by all, trusted by none. Perhaps the most devastating legacy of Charles IX's reign was the shattering of the sacral image of monarchy. For centuries, French kings had been perceived as divinely appointed arbiters of peace and unity. After 1572, that illusion was gone. The king was now seen not as God's chosen ruler, but as a partisan figure, compromised and corrupt, tied to the bloodshed of his own subjects. Even among Catholic intellectuals, a shift began. Thinkers and jurists started to question the moral foundations of royal power. The massacre, combined with the visible weakness of Charles's rule, triggered the early stirrings of monarchomach theory, the idea that a tyrant could be legitimately resisted. For the first time in French history, serious voices began to speak of conditional obedience to the crown. The monarchy never recovered from this rupture during the Valois era. When Charles IX died in 1574, his brother Henry III inherited a throne already hollowed out by betrayal and distrust. Huguenots no longer saw the crown as a neutral guarantor of rights. Catholic hardliners demanded complete submission to Rome and refused compromise. The wars of religion would continue to rage until the early 1590s. Charles IX's death marked the end not just of a life, but of a belief system. The idea of France as a united Christian kingdom under a divinely guided monarch was irreparably damaged. The crown became one of many competing institutions, no longer above the religious and political fray but entangled in it. His reign had not caused the fragmentation of France, but it had made it irreversible. Thus, the legacy of Charles IX is not simply one of blood, but of disintegration. He became the symbol of what happens when a monarchy fails to govern, when fear overcomes leadership, and when violence becomes the preferred instrument of policy. He was not a king who ruled, but a king who broke.